Good evening and welcome back to the Washington Outsider Report on the Coalition Radio. Today we'll be discussing the topic of how it came to be that Qatar, which has been recently announced as as a major non-NATO ally of the United States, is funding radicalization in the West. With us today is a special guest, Sam Westrop, who directs the Islamist project under the Middle East Forum. And for those who don't know me and who are newly joining the program, my name is Irina Tsukerman, and I'm the editor-in-chief of the Washington Outsider. Sam, welcome to the Washington Outsider Report. Before we dive into the specifics of Qatar's funding for various forms of radicalization, could you tell us a little bit about yourself, the Islamist Watch and Middle East Forum?
Absolutely, and thank you very much for having me on. I am the director of Islamist Watch, a project of the Middle East Forum, a think tank set up quite a few decades ago to advance America's interests in the Middle East. But it also focuses on the subject of Islamism, not just Islamism in the Middle East, but also lawful Islamism in the West as well. When I say lawful Islamism, I mean everyone but the jihadists, all those modern radical networks that underpin extreme Islamist movements around the world. I have been doing this for the last 12, 15 years now. My focus is mostly South Asian Islam and its Islamist offshoots. But in recent years, due to geopolitical changes, I've been particularly focused on Qatar and a couple of other Gulf states as well. My interest has always been with the lawful and on the non-violent. I regard them as more dangerous in the long run than the jihadists. The jihadists may bring a sudden explosion that changes a few lives for the worse momentarily, but the Islamist extremists, the non-violent, the lawful radicals, well, they work to change entire nations. They work to subvert institutions, undermine democracies, cause a pernicious kind of damage that can't be undone. So my focus has always been on these lawful groups and movements that engage in this slow, long march through the institutions. And I do that in collaboration not just with other counter-Islamists around the world, but also reformist Muslims. And it's a key tenet of the Middle East Forum that if radical Islam is the problem, then moderate Islam must be part of the solution. So we work with reformist Muslims of all stripes. We fund them, we partner with them, we organize joint projects and seminars and conferences with them. So we're very much of the view that there is a clear distinction between Islam and Islamism, a distinction that not a huge number of counter-Islamist groups always bother to provide. But we're very keen on that. And we also regard ourselves as pretty well informed on the subject of ideological trends, how Islamism is changing, how it's changing in the West, how it's changing in the East, and how one affects the other, how the internal politics between various Islamist groups will affect Islamism in years, if not decades, to come. So there's a whole array of interests that we have and focuses that we have pursued. But we're here to talk about Qatar tonight, and we've been working particularly closely on that over the last few years. And I won't pre-guess any of your questions. The only thing I will say is that had this been 10 years ago, we would probably be talking about Saudi or another Gulf state as a major funder of Islamism around the world. And I talked about studying ideological shifts, and this is a key part of what we do at the Forum. What I've been doing for the last 10 years is understanding how events in the Middle East affect the politics of Islamism here at home. And I think there is no greater example of this in recent years than the fact that the very country we would have once regarded as a key part of the problem, Saudi Arabia, now appears to be perhaps part of the solution as well. And that it. And very last thing I'll say is if you want to know more about our Middle East Forum's work beyond the subject we discussed tonight, please go to meforum.org, where you can find our various essays, writings, and projects.
Excellent. Thank you so much for your introduction. The issue of political Islam or Islamism is overall poorly understood and underappreciated in Western countries who have welcomed many strains of Islamists, including the so-called non-violent Islamists as quote-unquote dissidents. What ended up happening, I don't think I need to tell you, but I think it's worth noting that when most people say political Islam or Islamism, they usually think of the Muslim Brotherhood, but there's a lot of different groups, not just the Muslim Brotherhood. And I'd like to start my discussion of Qatar and its role in funding this sort of extremism and radicalization in Western countries by talking about what forms of political Islam Qatar seems to prefer to support. Is it indiscriminate? Is it opportunistic? Or is there a coherent strategy to what groups it partners with and pushes in Western, particularly in the West?
That's an extremely good question. And the full extent of the answer isn't quite known because Qatari funding remains pretty opaque, pretty unknown for the most part. I would guess that we at the Middle East Forum probably know more than anyone else, save for perhaps a few intelligence services, but we still know a very small amount of the total funding. So I'll give you a couple of examples. You're right, traditionally, that in the West, counter-Islamism has focused on the Muslim Brotherhood, perhaps over-focused on the Muslim Brotherhood in some instances, at least at the risk of not then focusing on other equally problematic Islamist groups. I think Qatar knows this. I think Doha has realized that it may pay to fund other Islamist groups less in the spotlight than the Brotherhood. But that said, the Qatar has still been a very serious supporter of the Muslim Brotherhood or the Ikhwan al-Muslimin over the years. And Egypt, Saudi, the UAE have made this point perfectly clear, and I think they've proved the case pretty well that Qatar remains a serious funder. I think the best way, though, to understand the full gamut of Qatari funding of Islamism in the world is to divide it into jihadists on one side and lawful, non-violent extremists on the other. And so in the jihadist spectrum, well, boy, you can look across a really quite wide variety, from hosting the Taliban, a Deobandi movement in Doha, to moving money to all forms of different Salafi terrorists in Syria, to Qatari money increasingly working its way into South Asia and Pakistan and the Far East even, and undoubtedly subsidizing militant groups wherever this general thrust of money ends up. But the lawful Islamist component, especially in the West, is a little more complicated. And I mentioned that we have only been able to uncover a small proportion of it. And that's because, at least this is our analysis after quite a few years of studying this, that Qatar looked at how Saudi went wrong when it came to funding Islam in the West. They looked very closely at where Saudi went wrong, because the fact that Saudi funded Western Islam was known by pretty much every single American you could find. It became part of popular knowledge that Saudi Arabia was funding mosques across the West. Qatar, can anyone name a mosque in America funded by Qatar? Not many. I can think of two, but that's only because I've been over thousands and thousands of rows of data on this subject for the last few years. So I think Qatar looked at what Saudi did and thought this is not a sensible way. Firstly, funding everyone generates a lot of attention, both to your recipients as foreign agents of the Qatari state, but also to us, Qatar. It pays attention on us and what kind of values we might be attaching, what kind of strings we might be attaching to this funding. So Qatar was a lot more sensible when it came to funding Islamism in the West. It moved money more carefully. It chose its recipients more carefully. The Saudis would fund anyone pretty much, as long as you weren't Ahmadiyya or some sect or Shia or some sect of Islam that was deemed beyond the pale. A huge, wide array of Sunni Islamic movements and sects got Saudi money, even if they didn't follow the Wahhabi creed. Qatar, though, despite being technically a Wahhabi state, Qatar is much more careful about who it funds, and it chooses its partners with great care and with a keen eye on the greatest return. That's what they're looking for. They want their money to be efficient. So unlike the Saudis, they don't move money just generally into mosques. Their preference is to set up institutions, lobbying firms, legal organizations, charities of their own. And so if you're talking about the US, I'm referring to groups like the Qatar Foundation, very important major foundation in DC, linked to the Qatar Foundation in Doha, but moves millions around to US public institutions, working with domestic Islamists, but moving it to US public institutions. So in other words, rather than funding the Islamists directly, they're providing the services that Islamists would otherwise have to or want to provide. So relying on the fact that money is fungible, it's an enormous subsidy of American Islamism, but you're unable to link the Islamists directly to their benefactor, the state of Qatar. Now, there are exceptions to this. In Europe, until relatively recently, the Qataris were more willing to fund mosques and religious institutions. And the evidence of that was public and pretty well known. Still, nothing in comparison to how the number of mosques and grantees that Saudi had 10, 15, 20 years ago, but still significant enough that we've come across it. So this money that comes out, yes, it ends up benefiting Muslim Brotherhood networks, but also Jamaat-e Islami, especially in the UK and the US. Jamaat-e Islami does very well from Qatari funding. Supporters of the Turkish regime increasingly find some degree of support from Qatar. And there's certainly a very large network of Western Islamists tied into the Turkish regime's interests here. Then there are a whole array of very prominent South Asian Islamist networks operating here. I'm talking about the Deobandis, I'm talking about Barelwi groups like Dawati Islami, then I'm talking about specific, rather unusual sects like Tanzim-e-Islami, if any of your listeners have heard of that. These are obscure sects that are very important Islamists in their own right. And yes, Qatari money has been subsidizing their efforts, or at least providing the services that help these Islamists advance their agenda. So this is a complicated subject. The last thing I'll say on this point, or at least the last point that answers your question, is that one of the reasons, the many other reasons Qatar has been so careful about this, is because they like to foil the work of people like us who look into this and research this. So the amount of actual public source data that can show all this is very small. And to a large extent, I'm taking the few examples we have and extrapolating. So it could be the case that somewhere, some Salafi mosque in, who knows, Philadelphia is taking hundreds of millions of dollars straight from the Qatari regime. The evidence for that remains absent. The biggest data haul that has been found that that hints at the scale of Qatari funding around the world was actually produced by us a few months ago. It's called the Eid charity, a major Qatari regime organization founded and run by the ruling Al Thani family with Al-Qaeda fundraisers on its board. The Eid charity, we discovered 45,000 financial transactions the Eid charity had made to Islamist groups around the world. We went through these transactions, we translated the text, we delineated them by country and by type of grant, and we wrote 5 or 6 big hard-hitting articles that were picked up quite widely. We also published the data, so anyone listening to this can go look through this data to see whom the Qatari regime is funding. Thousands of grants in Europe, only one single grant among those 45,000 in the US. This would suggest we're right, that the Qataris are being very careful when it comes to America about how they move money into this country. Very careful indeed. And it could be because of America's slightly more stringent foreign agent laws and concerns over foreign influence that have dominated so much of American public conversations over the last few years. Or it could be because the Qataris find a better return on their investment by funding these other services, universities, lobbying firms, legal groups, activist groups, all these things that I mentioned.
Saudi Arabia ended up sponsoring mosques and other forms of dissemination of Islamic teachings, in part as a response to the Cold War concerns about communism, in part with approval and full knowledge of the United States and other Western allies, and in part as a self-defense measure against encroachment of Muslim brothers, actually, ironically. But what explains Qatar's interest in dissemination of these specific ideologies. After all, the Al-Thani family is a traditional, in many ways, uh, Middle Eastern monarchy. It is not. Um, what does it find appealing in this ideology that, in some respect, is a direct threat to its own rule should the Muslim brothers ever change their mind and choose to cut ties with their
Mhm.
benefactor? They could, in fact, be a threat. So, what on earth uh, is pushing the Althanians to act in some ways against their own interests in the region?
Sure, that's a very interesting question. I think you can certainly claim that Saudi had some mitigating factors in its Wahhabi agenda and its funding of Islamism around the world, but you mustn't leave out the biggest factor of all, which was ideological sympathy for its grantees, which did occupy a great deal. Now you can argue that was more pushed by the clerics than the ruling family in Saudi, and that's fine. That's a separate conversation. But support for the ideology was a key factor, and it remains so with Qatar. And that does explain Qatar's primary motive in doing what it does. It is ideologically on board. Qatar is technically a Wahhabi state. It is the official religion of Qatar, and that Wahhabism, brings it into the orbit of all manner of Salafi organizations. And then, more curiously, also more politically minded, often Hanafi networks like the Ikhwan al-Muslimin. And so that Qatar funds the Brotherhood doesn't make perfect ideological sense. There is obviously a political element to it as well, and it's a geopolitical element. And you can cite a number of factors. So maybe it's an attempt to use the Brotherhood to advance the tiny island nation of Qatar's influence beyond its geographical size. Certainly being the patron of an enormous Islamic diaspora across the world, especially in the West, is particularly helpful. Maybe Qatar is doing it in order to rival Saudi and to assert its own dominance in the region. So I think there's all sorts of Middle Eastern and Gulf-based factors that we could discuss and could get into. But I prefer to stick to the ideological point, really, which I think has to be a serious part of it, that the ruling Al Thani family, despite, as you say, their historic Arab or even Arabist background, still contain an element of theocratic intent, of theocratic endeavor. This does guide a lot of what the Qatari regime does, and we see that with the people it keeps close to the royal family, advising the royal family, the kind of persons it appoints to the various charities and organizations Qatar runs and that it uses to advance its radical agenda across the world. Ideology and a long-term attempt to subvert and alter and damage Western democratic institutions is just a key part of the Qatari regime. And we see this in all other areas of how it operates. Only the Qataris would be both a non-NATO major ally and also the leading financier of Al-Qaeda organizations around the world. And it's precisely that bizarre duplicity and bizarre contrast on which the Qataris thrive. And they have thrived for a long time. And my God, is the West stupid for falling for it year upon year for decades. But it is ideology, I feel, has to remain the crucial explaining factor for all of this.
Let's help unpack this ideological motivation a little bit more, because I'm trying to grasp what precise aspect does the Atheni dynasty exactly support. Do they believe in a borderless caliphate of some sort? And if so, what is the precise vision? Because the monarchs there do not live the austere fundamentalist lives free of alcohol and 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 opiates and so forth. Quite the opposite. They're well known for their absolutely un-Islamic orgies and excesses in every aspect, to the point that it has become a joke in most circles. And so I'm trying to figure out what precise strain of Islamism do they find compelling, and simply because the way the country itself operates is so contradictory. The women there are essentially are essentially slaves. The internal situation is by far some of the worst in the Gulf, and uh, the racial practices inside Qatar are infamous. They actually practice segregation in various places. So, but at the same time, a lot of the actors are very much enjoy the I suppose the deceptive aspects of secular existence. So what exactly do they envision when they're pushing Islamism? What sort of a world do they want to see? Because to me, this simply does not add up. Al Qaeda's vision was utopian but clear.
Mhm.
Muslim Brothers, in their most traditional form, again, you can argue that politically they may be confused as to how exactly, but in terms of theology, lifestyle, it also seems pretty clear. With the Qatar-backed project, I am at a loss as what exactly they're trying to implement.
Mm. It's a good question, and it's not just the Qataris whose the exact nature of their Islamism is hard to discern. There are other Islamist networks who do not have this clear utopian vision of a perfect Islamic state that, as you say, that you find within Salafi jihad circles. There are plenty of others. The big phenomenon in the US right now is this new strain of modernist Salafism. Salafis who stick to a very austere interpretation of mostly Hanbali Islam, but have embraced certain left-wing Western political ideas and somehow have married the two. And a particularly good example of this is Omar Suleiman, very prominent imam who's very close to the Qatari regime. In fact, he was in Doha for the recent Doha Forum event, which brought Western politicians and Western Islamists and Taliban representatives all together in one room. And Omar Suleiman is a really good example of this same question. Yes, he has this Islamist background. He adheres to some pretty hardline ideas, but he genuinely seems to believe in obscure progressivist Western conversations such as minimum wage and even to some extent a question of sexuality and progressivist views over that and gender as well. So what is his Islamism? What is his caliphate? What is this world in which you have this apparently sort of almost Marxist aligned Islamist imam, one of the leading imams in America? What does his caliphate look like? I have no good answer to this. And it's the same for the Qataris in a way. What is the Qataris' vision when their Al Jazeera English and AJ Plus stations put out this progressivist and modernist ideas? Is it just a sham? Is it just a facade to advance a more clear-cut idea? Or is it just more generally about the idea of spreading dissent and chaos, things that benefit Islamism in a general sense, but don't advance it in a specific way? And that would be my conclusion for the most part, is that in some ways the Qataris operate like the Russians do when it comes to disinformation in the West. They're not really supporting a particular side in any case. They just want to sow chaos. They just want to cause trouble for the West, trouble for its democracies, trouble for its moderates, trouble for anyone who opposes the march of Islamism. I suppose if you really had to boil down to it and say, well, let's say the West collapse and now the Qataris are at the forefront of this new world in which they can establish a caliphate, I've no idea what it would look like. I've no idea. I think at that point, and my suspicion is that the Qataris don't either. They haven't thought this far ahead. This isn't a well-informed Islamist movement with its own apocalypse sort of end scenario. This is a bad actor who has jumped onto a cause, picked up a cause, and is using it to sow chaos. I don't think they've thought through their theocratic designs. I think they're focused on the present, on their geopolitical designs for the moment. That is my impression. But Qatar remains such a mystery in so many ways, partly because of its size. This tiny country, whose views we hear predominantly not through its officials, but through its proxies, through these Islamists it hires to run its institutions and its charities and speak for it in the media. How many of them are actually Qatari? How many of them are actually members of the ruling Al Thani family? Very few, in fact, almost none. So actually understanding their agenda remains a real challenge. I'm not saying we should give up on this, but I'm saying it requires a lot of additional study and observation.
It's quite interesting that you noted the use of proxies for making these statements about the general, uh, about their policies and so forth. Because if you look at social media accounts of Qatari influencers, those figures inside the country close to the regime, you will see that their comments a lot of the time in Arabic are anti-Western. They have certain political and theological strains, and yet, for whatever reason, all these statements are ignored. Only the English language statements are taken seriously, and there's almost no response to these comments by Western governments or media or influencers, whereas similar comments from somebody in the West or from Saudi Arabia or from anywhere else on the planet would at least arouse discussion, if not outrage. What is this? Is it just a matter of them being able to pay off people to stay silent, or is there a genuine lack of understanding about this double discourse?
You're asking all the right questions, and I wish I had clearer answers for you. The fact is, this baffles me too. It completely confuses and worries me. You're right, but right. These various, whether it's media anchors or prominent officials linked to Qatar, they say one thing in public or in English, as you know, and an entirely different thing. Now, this is not unique to Qatar. Of course, the Ikhwan was and various other Islamist groups were famous for saying one thing in public and another thing in private. In fact, it's a common feature of extremist movements in general that they will make sure to lie when the cameras are turned on. But Qatar has perfected this to an art, especially through something like Al Jazeera. And it's fascinating to switch on AJ Plus, their progressivist social media arm, and see them running a documentary on trans rights for women in prisons or something, and then switch on Al Jazeera Arabic and see them advising on how to beat your wife. So this contrast, this absurd contradiction just really sums up the Qatari duplicity. But then again, this duplicity exists at the very heart of Qatar. And if you ask how is this possible, I've got to say, if both the Trump administration and the Biden administration can consider Qatar a major ally, while Qatar moves money into the hands of Jabhat al-Nusra, various al-Qaeda affiliates, openly, groups that have killed and want to kill American civilians, well, if our presidents can't get it, what hope do we have for the newspaper editors? I'm not surprised that this observation has not been noted, because this refusal to recognize Doha's iniquities has plagued us now for at least a decade. And it's an old story that we could have this conversation too, by the way, about Pakistan or Turkey or quite a few other states. This is not just limited, but Qatar is such a good example of this blindness on behalf of the West. There is one thing which I mentioned. You asked if people have been paid off, and to some extent, yes. I don't mean in the sense that there's, Qatari money is flooding its way into every politician's coffers, but some certainly is. There are Qatari-linked donor clubs, Qatari-linked businessmen, Qatari-linked PACs. Qatar has an enormous lobbying operation in DC. It has lawyers and PR firms in fact, Pakistan, which I just mentioned a second ago, has based a lot of its own efforts in recent years, especially under the recently deposed Imran Khan government, on the Qatari model of influencing America. It borrowed from the Qatari model because it was so successful. But the interesting thing about Qatar is that it doesn't just want the soul of the left, it wants the soul of the right as well. So Qatar took a break from the usual Islamist habit of just working with progressivists when it comes to political endeavors, and has been working with conservatives as well. So, my colleague and I a couple of years ago noted a number of columnists in right-wing American media who were being paid for by Qatar, who had their salaries paid for by Qatar or receiving some remuneration. There were paid advertisements in major American media. For example, the Washington Times One of their columnists is a paid Qatari operative, for want of a better word, and the Qatari regime continues to run adverts in the Times. And it has this array of writers and activists who pop up in conservative media praising the glories of Qatar to all who will listen. So yes, Qatari money is working its way around. There's also the university question. Qatari money in our universities. In Doha, quite a few American private universities, as well as one public university, operate campuses in Doha. And with that, you win academics. And with the academics, you win access to various federal programs and government as well. So no, this is a full-fledged effort. Qatar lies and gets away with it, partly because of our stupidity in the West, but also partly because they're willing to grease the palms of anyone who might question this troubling arrangement.
Now, I've had conversations with quite a few of former Trump officials, all of whom bristled at any suggestion that Qatar should be dispensed with altogether. At best, they would admit that it's far from a perfect ally, and US should be exercising more stringencies on some issues, but nobody was willing to admit that there is no way that so much power should ever be concentrated in so few hands, and the US should ever be allowed to let by such a small concentration, such a concentration of so few people with so much power. It's not a good combination, leaving aside everything else. It's simply it's a family with a country. You know, whereas you can talk about Saudi Arabia, it has a sizable population. Turkey is a huge country, so is Iran and Pakistan. They have populations in various points of history. There's been a degree where cooperation could be lesser, greater, and so forth. Qatar, there's no great likelihood of change. It's a very, very small country. One tribe controls it. Very few people within the tribe have any real actual power to do anything, and it's people who are not likely to reform in any near future. We don't see trailblazing reformers among them. It's very obvious that the tendency is not going to change. So, nevertheless, there is this reluctance to admit that allowing Qatar exercise that much power is a huge mistake. Now, it's one thing when we're talking about its troubles in the Gulf vis-a-vis other Gulf states. We can say, well, what other countries do among themselves, it's their business. The problem is US is becoming a playing field for some of these rivalries and for active efforts for Qatar to exercise soft power in the US and implement active measures similar to what Russia is doing. There's a lot of outrage about Russia's active measures for what they're worth, much less so, but Qatar, despite the fact that there's much more funding going towards those things. So let's talk about what actually happens as a result of all this money flowing into the country. You mentioned universities. I have tried to penetrate the exact linkage between Qatari funding and the level of ideological influence on the students, but found that there's surprisingly little by way of precise study of how that money is disbursed once it hits universities. Is there anything more that can be said on the subject?
We'll clarify what you mean. Of funding to universities more generally, or what this funding then ends up doing? Or
yes, exactly. Once it reaches the university, let's say it's dedicated to the Middle East studies program at a particular school, how does it translate from the funding that reaches the university into the courses that then produce precisely the type of students that have the views that Qatar would find amenable and most Westerners would not?
Sure. I mean, the the parallel example that a lot of people like to give when talking about this are the Confucius institutes
Yes.
tied to China. And they point to the fact that some of these Confucius institutes would remove mentions of Tibet in some of their texts, or they would have quite aggressive language regarding Taiwan and so on. So the fear with the Qatari funding of Western universities is that much the same will come about, that even if there's not an obvious, immediate propaganda over the long term, it would yield a generation of academics who were sympathetic to Doha, who were intractably opposed to Riyadh, to the Emirates, to Cairo as governments as well, and who would be advancing the Qatari view of the Middle East and Islamism more generally. And I think that's probably partly true. I mean, what you if you're a young student doing Middle East studies and you're at Northwestern and you're sent to the Qatari campus that they have in Doha, of course you're going to be exposed to a very limited number of views, especially in an authoritarian country where a wide array of viewpoints is not particularly tolerated. So of course this indoctrinates some students and our future academics and future thinkers to some extent. That's not to say, of course, similar biases and madnesses within our teaching system don't exist independently of Qatar. And I think we all know the problems in Western universities when it comes to the social sciences. But of course, Qatari influence will hasten this radicalization, if for want of a better word, within universities. But there are some examples of more overt proselytization to the Qatari view in Doha, in this enormous academic city that the Qatar Foundation built in Doha, where all these foreign and Western university campuses are based. The institutions there are run by prominent Islamists. Tariq Ramadan even has an official position at the Qatar Foundation, which is linked to all these universities. And Tariq Ramadan, for any of the listeners who don't know, is considered really one of the leading voices of the European Ikhwan al-Muslimin, the European Muslim Brotherhood. Likewise, other very radical voices from around the Western world and the Arab world find homes within these university campuses. The Wall Street Journal has reported on a number of, twice I think, that events at these university campuses in Doha feature some of the most extreme preachers from the region. Hardline, radical Islamist clerics teaching hardline, radical ideas. And that's just the ones that a couple of newspaper reporters found out about it. When we've looked into this stuff, we see open support of extremism, open support of terror. We were looking into the Qatar Foundation, as I say, the group that hosts all these campuses, these Western university campuses. We were looking into the Qatar Foundation a few years ago, found open collaboration with the designated terrorist group Hamas. In fact, the leader of Hamas was visiting Doha to receive an award from one of the heads of the Qatar Foundation. So the terror links are clear, the extremism links are clear, and meshed in with all of this, interspersed with all of this, is an array of American universities, American academics, American students, and millions of dollars of Qatari money subsidizing it all. Yes, of course this will have an effect. How can it not? There has been an interesting lawsuit going on in Texas over the past few years, where they're trying to find out one of the universities with a campus in Doha is Texas A&M, and this is a public university, so they're subject, or they can be subject to certain public information request records under Texas law. And of course, the Qatar Foundation is doing everything it can to suppress this lawsuit and suppress these attempts to get correspondence to find out what the arrangement was between the local government and Texas A&M and the Qatari regime. So clearly the Qataris have a lot to hide, and finding out exactly what the conditions, what the caveats are attached to these academic agreements has to be key, has to be crucial. It's a strange world indeed when we're sending some of our brightest students off to a country that is outrageous not just to conservatives but to progressives as well. It's a country not just that funds terror, but that has death penalty laws for crimes considered perfectly decent acts within in the West. Homosexuality, other illiberalisms outlawed in Qatar. This is a country that enslaves its workers, slave laborers, builds the economy, and so on. All of these things should outrage all sides of the American political spectrum. And yet we seem to be at this position where we're sending hundreds and thousands of students over there every year to study at their fully paid for campuses. The huge fear in the beginning of Trump's term was this question of foreign influence. And you often hear Qatar mentioned, you sometimes heard Turkey mentioned, you often heard Russia mentioned, and you sometimes heard places like Turkey mentioned. But my God, surely Qatar is perhaps the worst example of them all. A country that's insinuating itself not just into our politics, but into the very heart of our universities as well, not just buying this generation, but the next one as well.
It's funny that I was not able to, through my research, there hasn't been a lot of study, or at the very least, what's known is not very transparent in terms of linking specific courses, specific textbooks use to studies, to departments that are being funded by Qatar, Middle East history, theological groups, and so forth. I was not able to find a lot of examples of specific textbooks or lectures that were being used.
Yeah. This is a really good question, and there's a great irony to this answer. The radical textbooks that sort of fit Doha's agenda already exist, produced by quite radical activists from other walks of life. And that you can see this with the Qatar Foundation and it's the teaching materials it produces for universities and for schools across the United States. The Qatar Foundation doesn't really bother to build its own curricula, to build its own materials. It just relies on extant radical works, including by far left Arabists and other ideological groups. No, the radicalism is all there. What the Qataris are doing is simply gathering it in one place and advancing it. You are right, though, that not an extensive enough survey of the exact link and the exact knock-on effect of Qatari money on American universities. Not this survey just hasn't been done, and it needs to be. I know a few people that are working on something, so perhaps there might be some success in that regard in the future. But in reality, as with so much of Qatar's efforts, too much remains unknown and opaque. So the more information we have, the better. And so just in case any students at prominent universities are listening, send us your textbooks. If your universities are taking Qatari money, and that should be public knowledge, you can check with the Department of Education. If your universities are taking Qatari money, send us your textbooks if they relate to Islam, if they relate to the Middle East. Let us know what they're teaching, how they're teaching it, whether they're presenting you with radical voices, with radical figures. This kind of stuff is really important, and as Irina has already sort of worked out, it's woefully understudied.
So here's the problem with the use of language radical and moderate, because Qatar has gone to great lengths to portray itself as moderate, and even as it welcomes figures like Yusuf Qaradawi and others of his ilk, it still presents, when it presents its officials to the United States, to London, they all appear very modern looking figures. And frankly, most people are not so educated in the basic premises of Islam as to be able to say what is accurate theologically, what is inaccurate, what has been distorted, what has been invented or fabricated, taken out of context, much less what is radically interpreted versus moderately interpreted. Those themes are unknown to average Westerners, particularly without any significant background in Islam. And when you have figures pushing religious discourse, what people think of as radical may be very well presented as something that people believe to be mainstream, even if it's not or hasn't always been. So given this theological disparity in knowledge base, much less ability to evaluate and assess schools of thoughts and thinkers and various figures who have influenced political and theological discourse over the years, how is anyone really to make assessment of what is basically propaganda masquerading as religion, what is a particularly stringent but legitimate interpretation, and what is quote unquote moderate, mainstream, yet not yet acceptable and tolerable and okay.
Mhm. It's an incredibly good question, and the one thing at least you can say for the Salafi jihadists is at least they're open about their designs. They're very clear about their iniquities, their sins, their desires to impose violence and cruelty. This is not a problem unique to Qatar, though. The question of the moderates or fakes dilemma. This is a question of lawful Islamism more generally. And we already discussed earlier the Islamists who say one thing in public and another thing.
I'm referring to something else. I'm not referring to the doublespeak or the hypocrisy or the pretenses. I'm talking about the actual interpretations of what they present as discourse. Let's say, for some people, Yusuf Qaradawi may be considered a mainstream Muslim.
Yes, yeah, understood. And Qaradawi is cited by plenty of moderates voices because he's a very significant man who's made very significant number of fatwa that are very important to Muslims of all schools of theology and jurisprudence. Even if they don't follow Qaradawi explicitly, he's a voice to be listened to. And this is a problem with the state of Sunni Islam more generally and the spread of Islamist voices more generally at the moment. And it's not for me to comment on the future of Sunni Islam and where it goes from here, whether in terms of its own ideological trends. My focus is Islamism, the radicals. I wouldn't like to try and guess the future of Islamic jurisprudence, especially. But sorry, no, go ahead.
Basically, my question is, how do we allow Westerners to determine who is an Islamist and who is a mainstream Muslim?
This is what I'm saying. I mean, again, and I hate giving these answers to you because it's so unhelpful, but you can't. You just can't, because you've got this huge problem now, whereby you have Islamists that will lie about what they want, but also Islamists who don't know what they want, and therefore interpreting. I mean, take for example a quietist Salafi movement like the Madkhalis. These are Salafis in theory, but in practice they don't want to impose their views on anyone else. They want to live this rather secluded parochial life. Very, very kind of conservative, very orthodox, but they don't want to impose it. Well, according to traditional interpretations or definitions of Islamism, these are Islamists because they hold these quite austere views of Islam that do involve an element of Sharia and as part of how society should function and so on. But in practice, how can they be Islamists if they're not actually going to impose these ideas on anyone else? If there's no caliphate, if they're not forcing religion on politics, then surely they're not. So this is a problem with the definition of Islamism, with the strains of Islamism deviating from our traditional sort of image of what an Islamist is. The worst thing is, as far as I'm concerned, from as someone who has to study this every day, is this new generation of Islamists in the West who have genuinely subscribed to progressivist and liberal ideas, and they now fuse that, as I mentioned earlier, they now intermingle that with their Islam and with their Islamism as well. So you have this bizarre mix of ideas that on the one hand could be almost reformist Islam, support for gay rights, very liberal views regarding women and so on, combined with then support for Islamist terror and other hallmarks of Islamist sympathy. So no, this is not a clear-cut point anymore. And one thing I think we failed at from the beginning was understanding the sheer diversity of Islamism, and that it was never just a bunch of people who wanted a caliphate and they were represented by the Salafi jihadists on the one hand and the Muslim Brotherhood on the other. That was, of course, a poor interpretation of the Islamist threat more globally. And Islam and Islamism both have hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of different sects or movements, all of whom believe slightly different things, and trying to find a one-size sort of catches-all definition to explain Islamism is very difficult, in the same way that it's very difficult to encapsulate a definition of Islam as well, given the different interpretations and even the extent to which the hadith are followed and so on. So this is very difficult. From our perspective, and as someone who runs a project called Islamist Watch, obviously being able to define Islamism is quite important to us. As I say, that's not to say that it's easy, but it's still important. So we keep to the view that it's anyone who wants to impose religious law on others, on Muslims and non-Muslims as well. So this imposition of religion in politics, in other words, the Sharia. And that's what we keep to. And there is no doubt in my mind that the Qataris are committed to this notion, the notion of promoting theocracy, of promoting religion within the public sphere and within the political world and in our politics as well. And they do this, yes, through AJ plus documentaries that undermine Western democracy on progressivist issues, but also through jihadi violence and through subversions of our universities and through funding of European mosques tied to the Brotherhood and so on.
It's very hard to counter threats that are amorphous, hard to define, and for that reason hard to identify, because and it's not just the issue of somebody who is a hypocrite and who's lying and misleading and deceiving. It's also because people don't have enough information to evaluate what those individuals are actually saying, what they're actually proposing, what do they stand for, and how they will actually behave if they get to a place of power. If they, if they're not advocating outright violence, if they get to political power by normal means and then happen to support positions that just happen to be in line with all those views, but still without violating any laws visibly, how do you say that they're a threat? If you have a politician who subscribes to all these visions and supports horrible policies, but was elected legitimately, you can't really get rid of them. Otherwise, other than trying to get the voter base to vote them out, but that may not be possible.
Well, you're quite right. But and again, this is not a problem that's limited to Islamism. The problem of radical anti-democratic political parties, for example, is also important. I mean, do you tolerate them? Do you allow these parties to flourish if they've got this, actually, even though they're operating lawfully and within the confines, but if you think their ultimate goal is the destruction of the very system that allows them to be there in the first place, then maybe that's something to rethink. No, this is very difficult. And as I say, we focus on lawful Islamism. So we're specifically geared towards dealing with these folks who do operate lawfully, and we have to come up with ways to convince policymakers that they pose a threat. And as you say, policymakers are often convinced that they can't possibly pose a threat because they're these nice men in suits who sometimes visit to lobby them in the capital, but otherwise keep themselves to themselves in their mosques or whatever. We can show them their rhetoric behind closed doors. That has some effect sometimes. We can show them sometimes when lawful Islamist movements cross over into terror finance, which happens far too often and with far too many domestic. That's also very, very useful for us. But we really need to show that these groups are ultimately committed to the destruction of democratic institutions and democratic society and the imposition of theocracy. And that's a little more difficult. It really came to a head in Europe during the height of the Syrian civil war, when you had thousands and thousands of European Muslims running away to join the Islamic State. And what was very clear at that time was that those who were radicalized were coming from the areas of Britain, of France, of Belgium, of Germany, areas of towns controlled by these same lawful Islamists. And what they came to realize, and what people like David Cameron, the former British Prime Minister, came to realize, was that non-violent Islamists, these nice men in suits who have learned to smile in front of the cameras and say the right things, what non-violent Islamists do is they provide the conveyor belt that takes a young Muslim into the extremist world and graduates him sometimes all the way to violence. So it was, for example, in Britain, groups like the Deobandis and Jamaat-e-Islami run a lot of the mosques and schools. These are hardline Islamist groups that had a real grip over British Islam. And it was from these areas where Jamaat-e-Islami and the Deobandis run the local schools and run the local community centers and run the local mosques. It was from these areas that British ISIS recruits emerged, almost exclusively. And the European governments came to realize that this conveyor belt is real, and that in order to tackle jihad, you must tackle non-violent Islamism as well. Now, once they accepted that, they started saying, well, who is funding, who is subsidizing non-violent Islamism? So a great deal of the conversation in France over the past few years, and Macron, who's just been re-elected, a great deal of his personal time is spent on warning about the threat posed by foreign regimes such as Turkey, such as Qatar, who are, they believe, funding the non-violent extremists. Those non-violent extremists in turn end up sending volunteers and radicals all the way to the jihadists, the other end of their conveyor belt. So this is a complicated thing to explain. It's not easy to explain. You can imagine that there are plenty of politicians who don't buy into this idea. There are also plenty of politicians who are convinced that these Islamists are nothing but moderates, forced out, I think, as you said at the beginning, exiles from foreign lands, escaping dictatorial Arabists. That's the sort of image that the Islamists put forth, and a lot of politicians buy it. America only has to look to see what's happening in parts of England and parts of France to see what happens when you let these lawful extremists take over communities and advance their agenda. It hurts Western institutions, it hurts moderate Muslims, it hurts everyone who opposes the imposition of Sharia, the imposition of theocratic religious law on political and societies in general. So that the threat is clear. Explaining the threat remains a challenge.
It does, and I think sometimes it's almost trying to explain this amorphous, fluid, hard to define situation does not solve well politically. Communism was easy to explain. Godless tyrants who wanted to confiscate your wealth. That's an easy concept to explain. Trying to reduce Islamists to some proto-jihadists is not that easy.
Yeah, yeah. And I'll tell you one other thing, and that's we've been talking about Islamist collaboration with the left for the most part, but we did discuss briefly the fact that Qatar likes to try and win over conservative voices increasingly. And in fact, one thing we didn't mention was rightly the Qatari new attempt, the attempt to set up its own right-wing media station in the US, which really flopped quite early on and didn't last a long. But it is a clear sign that Islamists regard the right as a key demographic to win over. And in some ways, it makes a lot more sense, especially the hard right, the really social conservatives. Because if you think about it, a lot of Islamists have a lot more in common with the hard right than they do with the far left, especially on some of the social issues we've discussed. So some of the things we're noticing recently is that some of the really quite unpleasant radical preachers, Islamist preachers, are openly now encouraging collaboration with what is popularly called the far right, white nationalist types, neo-Nazi types. And there is this genuine support and encouragement for the idea that this is where the future of Islamism in the West lies. So it's going to be very interesting, I think, to see over the next few years if the Qatari regime follows suit and starts moving money into the pockets of far-right groups in the West. My hunch is that this will eventually happen, and that Qatar, as it has always done, will fund every radical they can find, including neo-Nazis and white nationalists. This makes sense. And by the way, it has precedent. For a long time in the past, the Gaddafi regime moved money into the far right in Europe, for example. It makes sense that Qatar would expand its horizons. The amount of dissent and chaos available by inciting angry, white, indigenous Europeans is huge, and that fits the Qatari agenda enormously to cause this chaos, to cause this anger and dissent. And so don't be surprised if we start seeing far-right groups singing the praises of Doha sometime in the future.
I would not be, because we have already seen again the same pattern with Russia, which has played off both in leftist environmentalist groups and neo-Nazi and white supremacist types. And now it's exporting increasingly mainstream isolationism by people who would never have been caught dead with the white supremacists in the past, but now
Yeah.
very much make comments that are misinformed at best and you know alarming, increasingly alarming among mainstream people who are not who voted for mainstream candidates traditional most of their lives. So if Qatar hasn't caught on to that trend, I think it's only a matter of time. Now, I kind of wanted to come back to some of the specific operations that Qatar has been pushing lately. One of them is radicalization in U.S. prisons. That the Nation of Islam spread in prisons is nothing new, but the fact that Qatar is now funding that and similar efforts, that is an additional factor, and there seems to be no real follow-up to the recent article on that drew attention to that issue. What what do you think about that? Why is this not causing much more alarm?
Well, I mean, there's a whole bunch of stuff we write about and expose that I feel should cause more alarm. So I think there could be a media culture problem more generally. Certainly, both the right and the left don't want to talk about a lot of these issues these days. The right has traditionally been better in wanting to talk about it, but not all the time. Um, there's also, of course, other things going on in the world, as we've probably all noticed, and getting the attention of newspaper editors or politicians is particularly difficult at the moment. But that said, this seemed important to me, that a foreign radical state is funding proselytization and dawah and sort of outreach programs in American prisons is surely worthy of investigation. And so I was disheartened that it hadn't been picked up properly by anyone that we're aware of. We've got more coming out, though, which we hope will encourage. And we're speaking with a couple of congressmen who are vaguely interested in the subject. But the gist is this, is that we found, this is one of the few examples of direct funding to a domestic Islamist group from the Qatari regime that we have found in America. We caught $1.6 million worth of Qurans being given to directly by a major Qatari regime entity called the RAF Foundation, being given to a group in Illinois called the Furqan Foundation. And Furqan Foundation operates a whole array of front groups and things, from schools to halal certification, to mosques, to education programs. But their biggest export by far is proselytization. And they boast of sending a Quran to every home in America. Now that's fine. They do that they want to. The problem is they are hardline Salafi, with hardline Salafi clerics and ideas linked to them, as well as some South Asian Islamists as well from the Deobandi strain. So they're in a really deeply unpleasant group with extremist connections. They are taking these enormous sums of money, and that 1.6 million that we found out about was only for 1 year. It could be that they're receiving this amount every year from Qatari regime entities. We don't know. We just got this document for 1 year, and it was the only one available, and it was not public source. So we found this transfer of funds, and our Furqan Foundation uses this money to run these chaplaincy programs, these dawah programs in American prisons, where their officials also serve as chaplains, and which they use then to convert young Americans to Islam. But of course, they're not converting them just to Islam. They're converting them to Salafism. They're converting them to a Qatari-funded radical interpretation of Sunni Islam. So this is particularly worrying. Now, it's not the only institution backed by Qatar that is working in American prisons. There's also the International Online University, also known as the Islamic Open University, which is run by perhaps one of the most infamous radical clerics in the world, a chap called Bilal Phillips. And he's banned from a number of European countries because his extremism is so overt and so terrible. And yet this university has an explicit prison program that provides material for prisoners, and that is read widely in American prisons across the country. So these are the ones we know about. We want to know what else is going on, and we're convinced it's quite a lot. And the last thing I'll say is it's not just prisons. Chaplaincy programs in general, and any institution that allows religious influence, are all vulnerable to this sort of attack. So I'm talking chaplains in schools and universities, in the military, We've all found example of Islamist influence in these chaplaincy programs in the past, but really looking into it and seeing how foreign states such as Qatar are involved is pretty crucial.
Recently, you've also discussed the continuing flow of Qatar funding into charities in Canada, and that seems to me, eerily reminiscent of the Holy Land Foundation and everything that followed.
Yeah, yeah. So as I say, the Qatar, that Canada information came from the data dump I mentioned earlier of the Eid charity and these 45,000 grants. Money went to Canada, but just not to the US. So they deliberately avoided the US. But when it comes to Canada, yes, it was mostly not into humanitarian aid charities, but into mosques with registered non-profit status, those Canadian groups. A lot of these mosques are tied into big Islamist charities. The money really was primarily for building mosques, for expanding mosques and so on. The Holy Land Foundation and a whole bunch of other charities back in the 2000s took a lot of overseas funding, mostly from Saudi at the time, but also Kuwait and other places. There is a suspicion, and just talking about humanitarian aid Islamist charities, so groups like Islamic Relief, for example, Baitul Mal, very prominent American Texas charity, Helping Hand for Relief and Development, very prominent Jamaati Islami American charity. All of these groups have links with foreign Islamist regimes. Islamic Relief has openly worked with Qatari regime entities and openly reported some transfer of money to their British headquarters from Qatar. So we think, like the Holy Land and like Foundation and like these other big charities, some foreign Islamist money is working its way into the humanitarian aid scene. However, I believe we're the only people who have done this, but we did a complete survey of every single Islamic 501c in America, all 5,000 of them. We pulled all their documents, all their records, and we built a pretty extensive view of the finances of American Islam and thus also of American Islamism. And what we found a whole bunch of things. And if you want to read this, you can find it at our website at meforum.org. But one of the lessons from this huge survey of American Islamic finances was that far more money is sent abroad than is raised abroad. And it's no longer the case, as with 10, 20 years ago, that American Islamists rely on foreign states to fund them. They still may seek it and accept it because every bit helps. They no longer need it in the way they once did. American Islam and thus American Islamism is now wealthy enough to self-finance for a large part. And so actually more of the money ends up going abroad through these humanitarian aid charities than coming in. This partly explains, I did meant to mention this earlier, but this partly explains again why where we do see Qatari funding in the US, they're not giving money to the Islamists directly. They're providing the services, because the Islamists have funded themselves just fine. So the Qataris now step in and pay for the services, for the lobbying firms, for the universities, for the charities, for all these things, for the journalists, for all these things that set the scene for domestic Islamists to advance their agenda within America.
So I want to zoom out from these specific operations to the bigger picture, because right now what we're seeing is something not too dissimilar to what happened in Egypt under mostly Mubarak. We have seen that, a symbolic ban or attempt to fight overt extremism, while the so-called moderate Islamists are penetrating institutions, including law enforcement, including intelligence agencies, where Islamist organizations routinely provide training on Islam, on tolerance, on diversity, and so forth, to those countries.
Sorry to interrupt. You're talking about still during Mubarak's time.
Yes, where we've seen marriage of these groups to various institutions, the military, the educational system especially, but also government services. And we're seeing much the same thing happening in the United States and elsewhere, little by little. I mean, what can you say when you have organizations like CARE, which never criticized Qatar, by the way, ever, that I can recall, provide training to US intelligence and law enforcement agencies?
Yeah, and there was a great deal of damage done under the Trump administration by bringing care in from the cold, and funding was given to them, and they were welcomed into the halls of the offices of the Department for Homeland Security. And that was didn't start with the Trump administration. It was happening under Obama administration as well, to a strong degree. But care in particular, that started under Trump. And since then, yes, we've seen a surprising number of Islamists work their way both into the federal government, into the security institutions of the federal government, as well as law enforcement more generally, both local, state, and the FBI and CIA as well. So now this is a huge problem, and part of this lawful Islamist effort to infiltrate every aspect of the Western polity in order to advance its agenda. There's really very little one can do unless there's a more public awakening about the threat of Islamism. This is horrifyingly concerning, and yes, no doubt they'll cause a huge amount of damage there. You'll remember pre 9/11, there were folks warning about this in America as well. So we've been through this before, and it took a horrifying terrorist attack to wake America out of its stupor and make it realize that there's some very bad people with some very bad ideas had the ears of presidents and had the ears of very senior officials of major institutions. So this is an old story. The best we can do is expose these radicals' attempts, links to foreign regimes, expose their true views, expose the true aims of the organizations and the networks they represent. A big part of that involves transparency. So forcing greater transparency on public officials, on non-profits, on all the other vehicles which radicals use to advance their business, forcing transparency about their finances, their foreign links, all helps us to do this, all helps us to expose the true agenda of those who infiltrated our public institutions. But this won't be easy. They have the advantage enormously with this. It's up to us to prove that these people have nefarious intent, which is particularly difficult with a network so adept at lying its way into public office and positions of public responsibility.
Finally, I'd like to draw attention to another aspect of this. So far, we've been talking about Qatar's funding efforts to radicalize the US population, to turn it basically to its own agenda. It's promoting an invasive ideology. It's a parasitical force. But what we haven't discussed is the major non-NATO member part of it, which surprised many because Qatar, unlike UAE, Saudi Arabia, refused to participate in NATO exercises that involve Israel, which basically raises a few points. If you're not participating in military exercises with other US allies, how are you a major non-NATO ally if you can't even get along with everyone involved? It's also significant. It also has its geopolitical problems, such as its closeness to Iran, not to mention the various terrorist groups that you mentioned. Whereas UAE and Saudi Arabia have distanced themselves from those courses of behavior. People were asking, why was Qatar elevated above all those states that have actually reformed and moderated themselves?
Because Qatar worked very hard to ingratiate itself with the US military, providing this key military base for US operations in Afghanistan and elsewhere in the Middle East and parts of Africa as well. From the start, I doubt there are many in the US military who don't recognize that Qatar is being deeply duplicitous, but there's no doubt that it's been very helpful, even while it hosts the Taliban, even while it's in the long term deeply unhelpful to America's interests. In the short term, it did everything right. And the political class was certainly fooled. And I think this non-NATO designate, this major non-NATO member designation folks were able to sense it that moment when the Americans announced that Qatar would represent their interests in Afghanistan. It was clear that the Americans now saw Qatar as, for some reason, their greatest Middle Eastern ally, at least after Israel, and if in some regards, if not more so. So yes, no, this is the old answer that I've unfortunately been repeating a few times. It's political stupidity, international stupidity, and a refusal to recognize Qatar for what it really is. And really, I know I've said this before as well, but the parallels to Pakistan are enormous. This stupid belief among our political classes that yes, despite its problems, Pakistan can somehow be an ally in the war against terror, even as it's funding terror and itself. It's the same, and did that work for us? No. We worked with a country that was paying for the killing of US troops. We worked with them for at least 20 years post 9/11 in Afghanistan. We failed to recognize the true nature of the Pakistani regime and the ISI's intelligence services. Well, we're doing that exactly now with Qatar. We're refusing to recognize their very clear intentions, their long history of radicalism, and their open support for jihadists that have claimed the lives of American civilians and American troops. This is crazy, and it's not just us who are saying that. There are plenty of folks on both the left and right who have long expressed concerns over Qatar's behavior, but unfortunately, two successive administrations, one on the right, one on the left, both of whom refused to recognize the danger that Qatar presented, have led us really into a complete political fog, a complete political denial about what the future holds and the threat that Qatar represents.
As someone wisely pointed out in a private conversation, Qatar is not only going after the highest level decision makers that change every few years, but it has also penetrated the bureaucratic class that is permanent and doesn't go away with the changing administrations, which is a far more significant problem at the end of the day.
Yeah.
And the question of something changing in the near future is very unlikely, because even if you have an administration that is fairly aware, so long as you have the public servants who are being fed a particular narrative and are being incentivized to push certain agendas, Qatar will continue to be seen a particular way by the echelons of these implementers of policy. But meanwhile, we are repeating historic mistakes, as you've pointed out with Pakistan, and we're repeating the mistakes that other countries have already gone through. Mubarak, Europe, they've all found themselves in a lot of trouble due to the penetration of these extremist views and interference of foreign regimes. What is left for us to do, given the scope of the problem we are facing, given the fact that the funding Qatar is putting into perpetuating its own image is disproportionate to the amount of funding to uncover its efforts and generate transparency?
Well, you sort of hit on one of the answers there at the end, which is the funding is really the key part of the problem. So deal with the funding rather than just make foreign states proxies in the US register as foreign agents. Let's limit foreign money that comes in and seeks to affect our political system. You certainly can't argue it's for the interests of American democracy to allow foreign states to subvert our conversations and subvert our domestic political agendas for their own interest. No, there's no good reason to allow this. I take a pretty limited government view in most things, but it seems very clear to me that there is a clear democratic interest in limiting foreign interference, especially financial. And Qatar is perhaps the most guilty party of all of doing this. And it's not just attempts to better its own image, it's direct interference in our politics. If that's AJ Plus, promoting or attacking certain legislation, if it's the Qatar Foundation moving money into the pockets of certain districts, winning its support from the relevant congressman, or maybe it's Qatari lobbyists themselves directly lobbying the White House, directly lobbying our executive and legislative branches as well. No, limit the funds, limit the monies. And when you can't limit it, force transparency upon them. Make sure everyone knows who is behind a particular action and how it benefits them. No, this won't solve the problem. It will make it a lot easier to solve, however. And it's not just Qatar, of course, that will be caught up in the crossfire
True.
that emerge. It's Pakistan, it's Turkey, it's all these other foreign countries and institutions that seek to subvert our institutions. So this is vitally important. Cut the funding, enforce transparency.
Alas, if you go after one country, you have to go after all, and their interest tied in with China in particular, this is going to be exceptionally difficult to uproot compared to Qatar. China's presence is quite visible precisely because they're tied into so many sectors of US economy, but they deal with the same things. And it's, if you start enforcing these laws against one country, you have to enforce it against everyone, and
Sure.
many people are not going to be happy with that proposition. Quite simply, there's so much corruption. How do you get past that?
Sure, I absolutely there will be some who oppose this, but actually, as bipartisan bills go, limiting foreign interference probably has the greatest chance of support. The left will support it because they believe Trump was elected with the help of foreign interference. The right will support it because they're very suspicious of foreign subversion of our democracy. I think you're right. There are a few, especially who buy in or are tied into China networks, especially who will push against this, but I think they're outweigh. So I think this is actually not just an important step, but a very possible step as well, one that can be taken and should be taken. I also think there'd be tremendous support for this within American law enforcement and various other American institutions. You know, there've been quite a few foreign agent cases over the last few years. A big one involving Pakistan now almost 10 years ago now showed that the ISI was openly using proxies to advance its interests. The ISI, being Pakistan's intelligence services, was using its interests to advance its proxies to advance Pakistan's interests in the US. And certainly, every now and again, I hear of whispers of new investigations into different people, the person that never quite take off. So this would satisfy a great number of people deeply concerned with this issue. I think it's politically possible. And I think it makes most sense. I must say, one thing that we're very keen on at the Middle East Forum is just doing our small part on this subject, is forcing, I think I mentioned this earlier, but forcing transparency on non-profits. And so as part of their filings, forcing to report exactly who they fund overseas, exactly who funds them from overseas, and making sure that we don't have non-profits benefiting from the form of public subsidy by virtue of their non-profit status, then actually advancing the interests of foreign radical movements and foreign radical regimes, and exploiting the non-profit system to do that. This is a ton we can do to enforce these ideas. And as I say, I think we'll find pretty broad political support for a lot of them.
And are there any such bills currently being under discussion or under review in Congress that you're aware of?
Yes, well, there's actually one involving non-profit transparency that we didn't write, but that is we're quite interested in. And that's being pushed, I think, by several Republican officers, and I think we'll probably get some degree of bipartisan support, of Democratic support as well. My colleague who handles our Washington project, our lobbying work, be better placed to answer this question than me. But no, certainly there are some efforts being made already in this regard. Yes.
Excellent. I'm glad to hear at least some bad news, good news for the otherwise gloomy conversation. It's nothing new to me. Of course, I've had these concerns for several years, but every time there's some effort in Congress to bring any of these parties to some level of accountability, I see that there's either a smear campaign, an outrage by various institutions, and whether it was designating the Muslim Brotherhood as a terrorist organization, or forcing Al Jazeera to comply with FARA registration. It's been a never-ending process that actually never ends up with any degree of success. So it's precisely due to the pressure from the institutions that we mentioned. So hearing that there is some possibility of success on at least one issue, that is at least something to look forward to. I hope that we can discuss that further in the future conversation once it becomes a little bit further along towards implementation.
Absolutely.
Thank you so much for joining us today. It was a pleasure to discuss this. I hope the audience checks out the website, Middle East Forum, and the various projects, the Eat Charity data gathering place, and as well as the American Islamism project. Are they easy to find when you go to search? Do you need to? Is there a special category for those two particular items?
Yes, well, if you're interested in our Eid charity data, if you Google Eid charity files, it should come up with the Middle East Forum link somewhere at the top. But otherwise, go to meforum.org and click on articles, and you can view all our writings on these subjects and others, all with links to the relevant data as well. We often and always try to include primary source material so you can look at the evidence yourself. And finally, if you have any questions, I'm always happy to answer them. So please email me at Westrop, that's my surname, Westrop, Westrop, Westrop at meforum.org. I'm happy to send you the right link or answer any questions you might have.
Thank you so much. I certainly look forward to your future articles and, of course, all the great work that you're doing to expose these issues. This was the Washington Outsider report. That was Sam Westrop from the Islamist Watch, the Middle East Forum project. And stay tuned for next week. We'll be back at 9 p.m. Tuesday, the Washington Outsider report on the Coalition Radio. Before that, we will have a special episode airing this coming Thursday at 9 p.m. Usually we are once a week, but we do have a special episode coming up Thursday as well. Hope to see you all soon and have a good night. Thank you for joining.